transphobia on mainstream media. How shocking. Hey Spuds, it's Jamie, welcome back to another video, or your first video on our channel. I don't know, but welcome either way. I'm very glad to have you here. I hope you're going to enjoy this video. Is that the right wording to use? I don't know, because today we are looking at some transphobia that was recently on UK television. The news. Sky News, to be precise. Recently, the founder and director of an organisation called Transgender Trend appeared on Sky News. This was once again an example of trans people being spoken about and being spoken over by those spreading transphobic rhetoric and misinformation. Trans people are barely invited onto these public spaces to debate our rights and existence, let alone given the individual platforms that transphobes are so often given. Trans people's lives and trans rights are not something that should be up for debate. Trans people exist, and trans people deserve to live our lives as ourselves and access the appropriate healthcare, including in childhood. Transgender Trend, who are we? We are an organisation of parents, professionals and academics based in the UK who are concerned about the current trend to diagnose children as transgender, including the unprecedented number of teenage girls suddenly self-identifying as trans. They're referencing rapid onset gender dysphoria there, which is something that is unfounded and not supported by any trans-inclusive medical board. And the W Path has actively denounced ROGD as a thing and a term to be used. ROGD is not evidence-based, it's not scientific. We're also concerned about legislation which places transgender rights above the right to safety for girls and young women in public toilets and changing rooms, along with fairness for girls in sport. Typical transphobia about trans rights hinder women's rights. They don't. You are pitting trans rights and women's rights against each other, when actually if you just looked at the facts, they do not impede on each other, and trans women need women's rights. And trans people are the last people who want to take rights away from anybody. We believe that children with gender dysphoria deserve evidence-based treatment and have a right to the same duty of care as any other child. Okay, before we watch a little clip of the interview, we can have a very small chat about the evidence-based healthcare available for trans children and the science that backs it up. It's been found that early social transition for trans youth leads to positive mental health outcomes. A study into over 300 transgender youth with a mean age of 8 years old found that after 5 years, 97.5% were still identifying as either binary transgender or non-binary. It has also been stated that transphobes ignore decades of research that support the access to healthcare of both transgender adults and children. Medical associations support the treatment of transgender people, both social and medical. In trans youth aged 13 to 20 years old, access to gender-affirming healthcare led to a 60% drop in the chances of severe to moderate depression. And when I tell you that was me just going over a fraction of the actual evidence-based healthcare and science around trans people and trans children having access to the appropriate healthcare, I mean it, that was a fraction. If they're talking about wanting evidence-based healthcare, there it is, but your transphobia is stopping you from seeing it. Anyway, now that we've cleared that up a little bit, it's time to go through the actual video clip of what this person said on the news. Yay.
It challenges the idea that children are being medically transitioned.
I'm going to stop it already because children being medically transitioned is such a thrown about phrase. When this kind of phrase is said, the automatic assumption from people hearing that who do not know anything beyond what they've just been told will assume that children are being given hormones and having surgery in relation to being trans. That's just not true. If people are actually aware of the terrible state that trans healthcare is in the UK at the moment, they'd realise that trans kids are actually very unlikely to have an appointment anytime soon anyway, let alone receive any kind of gender-affirming care. Which, by the way, would be reversible puberty blockers that would be very stringently monitored, with 16 then being the minimum age for hormones. And it being very rare for people to actually get hormones at 16, and parental consent needing to be required. Children with accepting parents and families and guardians are able to make social transitioning steps to live in a way that makes them feel more comfortable and get on the waitlist to speak to a gender specialist. Then, after years of being on this waitlist and multiple appointments and assessments later, then maybe they might access puberty blockers. Just gonna throw it in there again that early social transition has been shown to lead to improved mental health.
And in fact, I don't challenge the idea of transgender people. What I do challenge is the ideology behind it. It's
So she doesn't dispute that trans people exist, but she's challenging the ideology behind the existence of trans people? Huh? What does that even mean? Some people are trans. The ideology behind that is that trans people exist, deserve equal rights, and deserve access to appropriate gender-affirming healthcare.
that children are being taught that they're a boy or a girl based on really regressive stereotypes rather than their biological sex. I think it's doing the theory of gender identity is doing great harm to children.
Please tell me where this is happening. I swear, transphobes have this image in their head where any slightly non-conforming child is suddenly shipped off to the trans factory. Not happening. And actually, when trans people did adhere to these stereotypes in childhood, transphobes say they can't possibly be trans because they adhere to the stereotypes. And then when they haven't adhered to those stereotypes, transphobes say, they must have been forced to transition because they did not adhere to stereotypes. In reality, there is a huge amount of diversity within the trans community, just as there is a huge amount of diversity among cis people in terms of gender expression, and people's gender identity and gender expression do not always match up. Granted, non-conformity to assigned birth sex is something that gender clinics will discuss, but it is one of many different criteria and symptoms, and on its own, it really doesn't mean that much, and certainly would not lead to somebody being forced into transitioning.
And it leads, once a child identifies themselves as transgender, then the medical pathway is experimental. It's essentially chemical castration of children.
You can't just go on national television. Trans healthcare has existed for decades. The use of hormone blockers has existed for decades, and not just for trans kids. Trans people, adults and children alike, deserve access to healthcare. And besides, if you think this healthcare is inadequate, since when has the solution been to stop the healthcare altogether and not to work on improving it? Besides, puberty blockers have been shown to reduce gender dysphoria. There's strict criteria to be able to access these blockers, and kids are monitored closely to check for any potential side effects from taking puberty blockers, and treatment is stopped or altered if these occur. And transphobes really do just conveniently ignore the decades of research that support the access to healthcare for trans kids and trans adults, with medical associations supporting the treatment of trans people both in adulthood and childhood, both socially and medically.
Or, teenage girls are being encouraged to have their breasts cut off if they identify as transgender or non-binary.
Wonderful bit of misgendering there, absolutely lovely. Just calling trans boys girls. The language is so grossly insidious. Teenage girls, wrong, are being encouraged, no they're not, to have their breasts cut off. Deliberately provocative description of top surgery. As far as encouragement is concerned, please go and do some reading about how difficult and long it takes to actually access healthcare as a trans person. From the 5-year wait lists to even see somebody for an appointment, to the multiple hoops you have to jump through, multiple appointments, multiple assessments, there is no encouragement. In fact, you have to prove yourself to be trans enough to access any kind of medical treatment. So sitting there and claiming that kids and young teens are being encouraged to transition is just so inaccurate.
So this idea that your body has to match your personality based on these really regressive stereotypes which we should have left well behind.
And that's it. Your gender is not your personality. Seriously, this is just an example of somebody who does not know what they are talking about, and then for some reason has been given credibility and a platform to spread this misinformation on. Trans people deserve better. This video was highly uncomfortable to watch. The fact that somebody was allowed to go on national television on a news platform and share this kind of stuff without even a trans person being present is horrible. The evidence and science out there supports the existence of trans people and supports that trans people both in adulthood and childhood have access to gender affirming healthcare. The only thing wrong with trans healthcare is that it's painfully underfunded and there is a real lack of access to it for the people that need it. There's such a broad range of evidence out there to show that access to gender affirming care results in positive mental health outcomes. And all major medical associations oppose legislation that would ban access to healthcare for trans children and trans adults. Now, can we please stop letting transphobes and people who know nothing about the trans community and the trans experience go on and talk about it it on television. They are spreading misinformation, they are spreading transphobia, they are fear-mongering, and they are harming the trans community. If you want to know more about trans people and you want to do a segment about transitioning and the lives of trans people and access to healthcare and all of this stuff, get actual trans people on your show. That's it for the video. Think about giving it a thumbs up and subscribing if you liked it, but no pressure if you didn't. And yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry for getting a bit irate in this one, but it really frustrates me. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye.